Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today we're sharing a conversation with Maria Mangini, a nurse midwife, scholar, psychedelic historian, and a longtime advocate for the preservation of underground psychedelic knowledge. Maria's life intersects with several crucial streams of modern psychedelic history. Early LSD culture in the Bay Area and at Millbrook, the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, Esalen in the 1970s, the work of Stanislav Grof, the emergence of midwifery and nursing as practices of care, and the long, complicated passage from psychedelic prohibition into the current Renaissance. In this conversation, we explore Maria's first encounter with LSD as a teenager, the strange mixture of recklessness and reverence that shaped early psychedelic exploration, her years at Esalen and her encounters with figures such as Stanislav Grof, Gregory Bateson, Leo Zeff, and others, the relationship between birth, death, and psychedelic experience, her doctoral work, Yes, Mom Took Acid, her work in medical cannabis and what today's psychedelic movement might learn from the successes and failures of cannabis legalization, the founding of the Women's Visionary Council, and her relationship with Anne and Sasha Shulgin, whose partnership helped shape the modern psychedelic imagination. This talk was originally recorded in a live format created by the Shulgin Foundation and hosted by Stacy Blank. The Shulgin Foundation is an organization dedicated to preserving and extending the legacy of Alexander Sasha Shulgin and Anne Shulgin. Sasha Shulgin was, of course, a visionary chemist credited with creating more than 150 psychedelic compounds and helping identify the distinctive psychological properties of MDMA. Anne Shulgin was a writer, artist, Jungian lay therapist, and an early practitioner in psychedelic-assisted therapy, especially known for her work with the shadow. So please, enjoy this conversation with Maria Mangini.
I spent the first 12 years of my education in Catholic school. The first 8 years or so of that, those things were, like even left-handedness, anything that was really eccentric was not well thought of. And so I don't think that those tendencies were ever completely eradicated from me, but they were I was encouraged not to show them. When I got into my middle teens, I encountered LSD in a completely accidental way. But because I had had this kind of early training that really, I think when I was in high school, the school that I went to thought I was going to go to college and some atheistic professor was going to attack my religion. So they set me up for all the kinds of arguments that people might make and stuff like that. So I had classes in apologetics and Bible criticism and all this kind of stuff. But when I took LSD, I had this container into which to put the experience that was not insanity. It was something holy. And it really impressed me and changed me. The only one difficulty there was that I came to think of the practice of the religion in which I had been raised, that the communion, which I had been taught was receiving the body of God within, was actually a kind of a placebo by comparison. And so my interest in studying the vehicle that got me to that realization began when I was about 16 and has proceeded since then. And I was just 76 a couple of weeks ago.
How would you describe the tone of psychedelic exploration within that era that you were part of? Were you seeing recklessness? Were you seeing reverence? Were you seeing an emphasis on the communal experience, or was it kind of all of the above?
When I look back on the actual occasions of things that I did when I was a young person in that way and experimenting in that way, I did crazy things. I did risky things. I was very fortunate that I didn't get into worse trouble. There was almost nobody of an older generation or a greater level of experience, particularly at first, from whom to get any guidance. And as I found those people, I found that I was very attached to them, and I got really, I feel like I had really profoundly good luck in encountering some people who were able to give me some guidance. Some of those people I encountered at Esalen. I had the good fortune to spend a good part of the second half of the 1970s there. And as a result, I got exposed to a lot of really smart people, not necessarily all of them who got smart because of their interest in psychedelics, but smart people.
Well, I do want to talk about your intersection with the Esalen Institute, but I'm wondering, What might we miss if we begin your story in the mid 1970s?
Well, my first LSD experience was actually in 1966. I was in the Bay Area. I left the Bay Area and went to college in the Hudson Valley in New York.
Mm,
My parents couldn't get me out of California fast enough. They saw that I was developing some hippie tendencies. Um, a remarkable stroke of good luck caused somebody who was a part of the community around the college that I attended to support my attendance there. So I was able to go east to school. My parents, both of them were from the East Coast, thought that was a really good idea. They thought I was getting really ghettoized in California, that I didn't know how to live in any other kind of cultural environment than that one,
mm,
which they were right about.
mm,
But what they didn't count on was that the school to which I went was 15 miles from Millbrook.
mm,
And I already had this interest in and affection for the states that you can achieve through psychedelics. And so I set about figuring out a way to stay in college, to do enough work, enough college work to be able to have the college life that I wanted, which was running off to be there as much as I could get away with. And then gradually that was right at the end of the time when Millbrook was a kind of psychedelic ashram.
mm,
So the place was kind of falling apart by the time that I got there, but not to the extent that I didn't get any of that. And I had experiences with people there where like the community of people that was living there at that time did things that wouldn't have been thought about or talked about in the environment from which I came. Like, I mean, I think people got up together and did things in their dreams, you know, like there was a dream life and a vision life that was quite normalized and talked about and appreciated that was there. This is the thing I'm thinking of when I talk about the the suppression of the capacity to do things that are now identified as paranormal, that I think everybody has those capacities, but they aren't usually developed in most people. There's a wonderful scholar, his name is Becker, who was at the University of Chicago years ago, who, as an anthropologist, I think he was getting his doctorate in anthropology, but he supported himself through graduate school by playing in a jazz band. And the jazz band, everybody else in the jazz band was a Black musician, and they all were marijuana smokers. And he had never encountered marijuana smoking as a cultural phenomenon or as a practice of any kind, but he kind of learned how to smoke marijuana from the people in his band.
mm,
And then he ended up writing his doctoral work on what he called the deviant career, like how you learn how to do something that's eccentric to the society in which you're ordinarily living.
mm,
And it requires a few things. You have to have a supportive community around you that doesn't reprehend what the behavior is. You have to have a source of, like, in his case, he had to have somebody who could provide the marijuana. Um, it's helpful to have companions. Well, in Millbrook, I had all of that. So I got reinforced in this appreciation for the idea that fearlessly, and sometimes I think quite senselessly, advancing into those realms was an okay thing to do.
mm.
And people didn't think it was nuts.
You end up writing a dissertation at one point called Yes, Mom Took Acid, where, if I'm not mistaken, you find that some psychedelic users become more socially responsible, more community oriented. Were you seeing any of that during that period of late Millbrook in New York?
There's a couple of things that are relevant to that. One of them is that the principal finding of my doctoral research was that the great majority of the people to whom I spoke, the theme that was common to the greatest number of them was that they had experienced a particular kind of interconnectedness, and interconnectedness with one another, with their immediate family, with their friend group, with their faith community, but also with the larger community and with plants and animals and with things like responsibility for stewardship to the planet. So I think a lot of people experience that kind of interconnectedness because the group at that time, and I'm talking about my like late young adulthood, late teens and early 20s, that the people who were exploring these realms at that time were a relatively small fraction of the larger society. And a lot of the time we had the tendency to be quite vivid, like florid. beads and bells and feathers and patchouli oil, and you could kind of, and also we were kids, and so a lot of us
Yeah.
were not very discerning about which parts of the personality that kind of went with being one of those people were ours, and which ones were kind of part of the package. So you could, if you saw a young man with long hair, you could kind of bet that he was against the war in Southeast Asia because it kind of came with the deal. We hadn't grown to the point where we thought about whether those positions were our positions. They kind of came with where we were in society. But people definitely felt interconnected in that way, for sure. I really discovered communal living and collective household activities at that time, and I still have stuck with that since then. Everybody that was a research subject for my dissertation was at least 40 at the time that I interviewed them. And the idea was that I wanted to know what they felt the longer range impact of their psychedelic experiences had been on the lives that they'd lived since then. So it was not really easy to see it in the group that was around me when I was first starting to experience this, because we were young people and still pretty unformed, I think.
Now, at some point, did your explorations take you back to California? I'm imagining if by the mid 1970s you're interacting with Esalen, you do come back to West Coast.
Well, I was from there. I mean, I'm from the San Francisco Peninsula. My undergraduate degree is in theater,
Mm.
and I had thought that I wanted to go to the Yale Drama School, and I did apply there and was accepted there and was supposed to go there, except for one thing. And that was that in my class, in my graduating class at Vassar, where I went to as an undergraduate, there were three theater majors. One was a woman named Judy Metzges, who I think ended up in opera in Europe.
Mm.
One was me, and the third one was Meryl Streep. And it was obvious to me that I was not talented in that way, that like I had been taught in my family of origin only to participate, to excel.
Mm.
And I realized that I was not going to be excellent in the way that she was. I didn't have the equipment to do that. So I was going to have to do something else. And I had a boyfriend who was in what was then called the Broadcast Communication Arts Department. Now it's called Radio, Television, and Film at San Francisco State. And I was very attached to him. So I kind of decided that instead of going to Yale, I'd get a master's degree in broadcast communication arts at San Francisco State.
Ah.
Well, it turned out that the person who was the chair of the department at that time was a clinical psychologist, because it was a communications department. And he was one of the people who gave some of the earliest seminars at Esalen.
Mm.
He gave a couple of encounter group workshops that were several day long. They were kind of long, the early long form workshops at Esalen. And he was introducing people to the idea of an encounter group. And part of his chairship of the department at San Francisco State was that he felt that all the incoming graduate students needed to take an encounter group, and he was the leader of the encounter group.
Wow.
Well, my boyfriend that I came to live there because of had been through that and loved this teacher and thought he was great. His name was Richard Marsh, Dick Marsh.
Richard Marsh.
And I was like 21. I was not very bright about relationships. In fact, I was particularly stupid about this relationship, and I was very competitive with this man. And so one of my competitive things was that I could make this teacher like me better than he liked my boyfriend.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about this that was, I mean, this is all fate as far as I'm concerned, but Dick Marsh had been in Zihuatanejo in Mexico with Tim Leary when in the first experiment in creating a psychedelic ashram that Tim and Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzger made before they started to try to do it in Millbrook.
Mm.
And he had some pretty memorable experiences there, not all of them good, but I think he thought they had been very productive. And he knew that I had the Millbrook experience. And so the two of us had this common language. And he really liked me. And yet he wasn't the kind of professor that fooled around with his girl students at all. So he wanted to do something for me. And what he did was he said, I'm going to introduce you to somebody. And he brought me to meet a peer, a clinical psychologist whom he thought I would like to know. And I that connection that was forged by that teacher turned out also to be a very formative one for me. Um, the person to whom he introduced me was Leo Zev, who was an early experimenter with group transformative therapeutic use of psychedelics, and he was doing that in an underground way at that time. And I became extremely fond of and involved with the work that he was doing. And it was he who introduced me to the Grofs and ended up causing me to go back to Esalen when in the 1970s. So I went to Esalen because I wanted to go there because my teacher was going to go there and I wanted to be part of the project that he was involved with. And then, pleasant fate made it possible for me to do that. And I stayed, as people will do. I
Well,
stayed until I got thrown out, as people will do.
well, Esalen serves as a crucible and a nexus. I'm curious what happens. So you're 21, you go to this encounter group, and I know that you become very involved in nursing.
Well, it wasn't specifically nursing. I went to Esalen in 1975 to participate in one of Stan and his then wife, Joan Halifax, long form workshops. The subtitled theme was shamanism. Stan was just finishing the manuscript of what became The Realms of the Human Unconscious, his book, one of his first books, published books in English. He was laying out the theory that he called the perinatal matrices. He had already, in his practice in Czechoslovakia before he came to the United States, he had been responsible for a few thousand administrations of LSD. And so he had all the observations from those experiences. And he had recognized that there was a pattern to people's entrance into and emergence from transformative experience that was similar or matching to the one that people actually biologically experienced in both giving birth and being born.
Mm.
He kind of postulated that the birth experience could become a kind of psychological template for people, which would then give them a lens through which to see transformative experiences of all kinds throughout their lives. Oh, well, I was born in 1950. I was 16 in 1966. I was part of a generation of activists, and I really saw myself as an agent for some kind of positive social change. And as I came to understand what Stan's theories implied, it occurred to me that if you could change the environment of birth so that it wouldn't be a violent, brutal experience, which at that time could happen. The custom was to take the brand new, wet newborn and hold him up by the heels and smack him on the butt to get him started breathing. And this was when Marshall Klaus and other people who were starting to espouse more humane
Mm.
methods of interacting with newborns were starting to get some traction in the OB world. And I decided that the interacting in the environment of birth specifically was a place where you could get a lot of action for not as much, for not a lot of investment,
Mm.
that it was a
Mm.
fulcrum point. So I decided I was going to be a midwife. Well, I had no science education and I didn't have children. And the direct entry midwives at that time really wanted you to have your own kids before studying with them, because that was part of your toolkit. But I happened to know, because of having been around Stan, I happened to know Gregory Bateson. And I had an opportunity to visit with Gregory Bateson and his wife in a kind of like, I was kind of in an adolescent stew of uh, Saturn return and personal direction confusion. And Gregory said, well, with everything that you know and have experienced, it's possible that you could be a midwife, and I'm going to introduce you to a
Wow.
midwife.
Wow.
So he introduced me to Raven Lang. Raven was one of the Santa Cruz midwives at that time who had the Santa Cruz midwives. Some of them were actually arrested for practicing medicine without a license
Hmm.
because women wanted to take more control of the environment of birth. And Raven allowed me to join the senior midwives rounds group that she had in Santa Cruz to talk about Stan's theories, even though I didn't have any birth experience. So I was going to trade them. They were interested in Stan's theories, and I was interested in learning about birth. And it quickly occurred to me that I was in a position to go to school. I had a good foundational education. I didn't have dependents, and so I did. And the most direct way to get credentialed in midwifery, which I hoped would be kind of an umbrella for some of those non-credentialed midwives, was to be a nurse.
Mhm.
And because I already had a bachelor's degree, the quickest way to be a nurse was in an accelerated nurse practitioner program. And I did that. I went into nursing without very much appreciation for nursing. I was trying to become a midwife, and
Mhm.
that was how you did it if you
Mm.
wanted to do it under the law. I've learned a lot about nursing since then. Nursing is a really spacious profession, and I'm very grateful to be part of it.
That is fascinating. I love how multidisciplinary you are. I'm wondering whether the interest in things like psychedelics and non-ordinary states of consciousness continued to sort of travel with you.
Well, sure. And it traveled with me in very much the same way that I think my early education intended for my Catholic faith to travel with me.
Uh-huh.
It was something that I shared a community of like-minded believers. There were always outposts of those kinds of like-minded believers in any geographic area in which I found myself. And um, if you're attentive, that was one of the things that I discovered when I was writing my doctoral work. How I found the population uh, that I interviewed was I had a button that had that title, "Yes, Mom Took Acid," on it. And this is the early part of the 1990s when I was doing this. And I used to wear that button on my outer clothes, and people would come up to me like in the supermarket or in a bookstore and say, "What's that button about?" Because they had these incredibly precious experiences, and they were ecstatic at the idea that somebody might want to talk to them about it. It was like being invited to go to somebody's house with the carousel of slides from your vacation at Yosemite and show them, you know. So people told me heart-stoppingly beautiful stories, really, about
Mm,
their psychedelic
mm,
experiences.
okay. You have a current interest in thanatology, if I'm not mistaken, which is the study of death and dying. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that too, and how that sort of intersects with your interest in the psychedelic experience and also in birthing.
Well, one aspect of that is that it's economical. The skill set that one works to develop to function with a high level of competency in midwifery is pretty much exactly the same skill set that's desirable if you're going to attend somebody at the end of life.
Mm.
And interestingly, it's the same skill set to almost completely to an almost complete extent to the one that's recommended for people who are trying to develop as facilitators of psychedelic experience. The ability to uh, be present in a kind of accepting, centered, non-traumatic, non-traumatized, non-traumatizing way with somebody who is deeply exploring a transformative realm is a particular kind of presence that you can work up to, you can work to develop. And it involves being able to be in the presence of somebody else's pain without making it be something that you have to intervene about.
Mhm.
Um, Being able to sit with anxiety and not have it become your anxiety. Um, those those capacities are useful in all those realms. And it's the case not just for me, but for, midwifery is a relatively small profession still. A lot of midwives who are contemporaries of mine who've, reached the point where it's physiologically difficult to wake up in the middle of the night and make sense. And babies get born when they get born. You don't necessarily get to schedule them. So I think midwives tend to age out of taking the kind of responsibilities that midwifery can require just because it's difficult physiologically as you get older to continue doing that.
Mhm.
And lots of midwives that I know have gotten interested in becoming death attendants of various kinds. Somebody was joking to me the other day that at some workshop, end of life studies workshop, more that there were a lot more death duelists than there were people with life-limiting illnesses. Like there are lots of people who have figured out that that's a useful contribution to make in the community. But that term, the idea of the doula as a role is one that actually originated as a way of attending birth and women in the immediate aftermath in the early postpartum period.
Hmm.
And it's transferred really well to the end of life because the skills are so similar.
Yes, and it also seems that the psychedelic experience serves as almost a microcosm of both of those experiences. Within the realm of a trip, there can be and often is a sort of dying or a shedding, let's say the ego death, which is spoken about so much, as well as the sort of birthing or rebirth of self.
Well, this is something that, once again, I was introduced to as a theoretical concept by early exposure to Stan and to his work and his thinking. And I think he has articulated how that fits together and transcends and transfers to a lot of different circumstances as well as anybody has.
Mm,
But it's also true that if you look into, you know, I know that both the kinds of experiences to which we're referring and the fact that there are substances that can give access to those experiences has been known in a lot of different kinds of cultures and environments throughout history. But the ones about which I know are the Western ones, the Euro-American ones. And if you don't have to look back very far,
mm,
there's a lot of increasingly credible speculation, for example, about the Eleusinian mystery, which was a central fact of forming the intellectual and philosophic environment of the classical civilizations that a lot of what canonical Western thought is based on, involved that kind of a death rebirth experience when people wrote as they did in only a very limited way because it was all secret and you could be put to death for revealing the secrets. But when to the extent that people wrote about Eleusis, they said you die so that you don't die when you die. And doesn't that sound right? You know?
it does. I love that. So I'm going to ask you about the way that you've become intertwined with the Shulgin Foundation and the Shulgins themselves.
Well, I think I mentioned that in my early life as a psychedelic explorer, that there were not a lot of elders present. There were not people who were ahead of us on the path. Um, I think that's one of the functions that Ram Dass really fulfilled,
Mm,
for a lot of people, is that he could be seen as somebody who had traversed a lot of the same realms in his personal life. And he functioned as an example for people in that way. And I am not a meditator. I am like the last person to put in the cushion time. I'm the person who's meditating in front of the stove in the kitchen. And so that was not one that appealed to me. But um, Anna and Sasha are, in the realm around psychedelics, there are a few really outstanding co-equal partnerships of man and woman who are mutually supportive and contributory to one another's work and fully ready to acknowledge the contributions that each partner makes. I would cite Annie and Michael Mithofer as an example of that. I was largely in Stan's life. I was largely a participant in his life during his marriage to Christina. And for example, if you talk about when he talks about the development of the holotropic breathwork, for example, he always acknowledges that that was a co-equal practice that was developed by the two of them together. And Anne and Sasha were a great example of that. They were so obviously in love, and they each brought something very particular to the interaction that they had, which produced this sort of contributory whole that was so much richer than the individual components. And you really see that in their books,
mm, mm.
like the way in which the love story is kind of interdigitating with the chemistry and how extraordinary that is. And so they were just very attractive. There was something vortexical about their energy. That's part of why I'm still involved with the farm,
Mm.
because um, the farm itself, as did the Millbrook environment, has retained some of that sense that you want to be part of that, like that was a good thing. I want to get closer to that.
Mhm.
Except the people that own the estate in Millbrook, which also has a lot of that kind of vibe left over from things that happened there, they do not want you there. They've done everything they can to make it so people do not come there, do not come there, do not come there. And the farm is not taking that position. It's really taking the position that it's not a bad thing for a faith community, if that's a fair thing to call people who've had positive transformative experiences from psychedelics,
Mm.
might want to have a shrine, like not a bad thing to have. Eslen's like that too, Esalen, the vortexical energy. I mean, it's easy when you have a hot springs. That's one of the Earth's erogenous zones. Why wouldn't people want to be there?
Oh my God, what a quotable. That's so great.
I wish that were original. It is not.
I love that. Talk to me about working on the front lines of medical cannabis, because you were very early to that, and the work that you did there really paved the way for a kind of mainstreaming of cannabis, I believe.
I hope we're going to learn as we increasingly surface the use of psychedelic substances, which I'm not exactly excluding cannabis from that. It's just in a completely different regulatory realm right now. As we learn from what has gone on around the use of cannabis, and hopefully are informed by that in moving in the direction of not putting people in jail for the use of psychedelics, that we're going to be able freely to acknowledge the places that we did the right thing and some places where we did not. I was never particularly passionate about medical cannabis. What happened for me was that back when I was talking about how I became a midwife, what I really wanted to do was to be a midwife. But the route to do that in the conventional realm of getting a license and not being arrested was to be a nurse first. So I became a nurse practitioner, and then I had a Robert Wood Johnson fellowship. I spent a year working for the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. I did a lot of outreach work with a lot of different kinds of homeless populations. I worked with the Lion Martin Clinic, which was the women's clinic of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. And I got really interested in using not only my midwifery education, but also the family nurse practitioner general primary care background that I had to get in order to get to midwifery. And in the early part of the 1990s, I went to work with a physician whose name is Frank Lucido, who really was passionate about cannabis and who wanted to do, who had, I think, been personally helped therapeutically by the use of cannabis, and who knew other people who were doing better when cannabis was a factor in their lives than they would be without it. And he became a kind of a crusader for the medicalization of cannabis. That was in part because of Val Corral, who was a pioneer. She and her then husband, Mike Corral, were the originators of something that was called Women's and Men's Medical Marijuana Alliance, Women
Mm.
and Men's Alliance for Medical Marijuana, WHAM. And they created an environment where medically indigent people in the Santa Cruz area banded together and grew marijuana gardens
Mm.
and harvested their plants and prepared and shared their medicine among themselves free of charge, and for anybody else in the community who had need of that cannabis as a medicine. The original medical cannabis law in California was written to accommodate a collective environment of the kind that Val Corral was creating in Santa Cruz. And I was very attracted by that because, remember me, I was the person who wanted to be an agent for social change. And I just heard a quotation of the current Pope saying, healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
Mm.
Now, that statement put in those terms, actually, I think David Smith of the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic was the first person to say that in that way. And boy, if there's something in the world that I believe that.
Mm.
So I really saw that what Val was doing was a real actualization of that kind of social conscience for people who were in need. And Frank, the way that nurse practitioner licensure has worked up until just very recently in California, you have to have a physician supervisor who signs off on whatever it is you're doing. And I entered into a relationship like that with him, and he was passionate about cannabis. So pretty soon we were evaluating people for whether they had a reason to use medical cannabis that was in conjunction with the law. The law said a Californian patient may use cannabis Um, and then it had a list of about 15 different conditions that you could use cannabis for. But then the enabling clause that was at the end said, or any other condition for which cannabis provides relief. So we started out interviewing people about the condition for which they used cannabis and what kind of medical benefit it gave to them. And we knew that we couldn't just be a card table in front of a dispensary where the skateboarders would come and say, oh, my ankle is sore, give me a pot card. We wanted to see people who really had a need for cannabis. And so we had a quite rigorous system in which we required that people have a treating provider that was taking care of the serious condition that they treated with cannabis. That was a great experience because this was not, this is when people would have a medical cannabis card. Sometimes if they would go to a jurisdiction in California, which wasn't quite as progressive as Berkeley or Santa Cruz, they'd get in the clutches of the law. I answered at our office a number of telephone calls from sheriffs in places like Lake County saying, this guy doesn't look like any cancer patient to me. And he says he's got a medical cannabis card from your office. And I said, and I would get to say, well, officer, not only did we examine him to determine that he has the serious condition that he medicates with cannabis, but we have independent corroboration from another provider who is taking care of him for that condition. And the person would say, oh, sorry to have bothered you. Now that's what you want, So our approach to medical cannabis was pretty rigorous, but people at that time said, oh, this is just the camel's nose under the tent. Well, yeah, now the whole camel is under the tent.
It is. What do you think are the most important lessons that this psychedelic renaissance, and as we might move towards some element of legalization with things like psilocybin, what can we learn from the successes and failures that happened with cannabis medicalization and legalization?
I'm 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 going to start from the contemporary perspective as opposed to going back to what I think was going to happen in the 1990s when this was just beginning, because my perspective about a lot of this stuff has changed a lot since then. I think one thing that we didn't do well was we didn't anticipate the ways in which people would get into trouble with cannabis.
Mm.
And because cannabis seemed so benign by comparison to other, like I talked to a fair number of cannabis patients in our family practice, many of whom were using cannabis as a harm reduction modality because in the absence of being able to use cannabis, they would be, say, for example, consuming an excessive amount of alcohol, which had another whole different set of outcomes that they didn't want. So those, I think I was very swayed by those positive uses without recognizing that there's a sort of irreducible minimum of people who are going to get into trouble with almost any behavior. I mean, I have a particular problem with potato chips myself. I mean, I don't want to trivialize the experience of people who've gone through addiction and recovery, but I can't be in a car with an open bag of potato chips because I will eat the whole thing. And it doesn't matter that I say to myself, oh, you said you were never going to do this again. Oh, this doesn't make you feel good. Oh, you're supposed to do this for, like it doesn't matter. And there are always people who are going to respond to almost anything that way. And I think we didn't take that into consideration when we dropped all the barriers to cannabis use.
Right.
I think right now people are starting to really investigate and explore how public education and professional support can really, I don't like to apply the term harm reduction to psychedelics specifically, because I think it's a question begging term. It allows for the implication that the behavior of using psychedelics is intrinsically harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So I prefer risk minimization actually as a more accurate way of describing what we're getting at. If I thought politically and socially it would fly, I would say benefit maximization. But I'll settle for risk minimization. Um, but I think we have to attend to that. And I think people are starting to do that now to really, you know, because I wrote a doctoral dissertation about psychedelics and I've been a kind of historian of particularly of LSD, but also of other psychedelics in Western European and American use.
Mm.
People ask me from time to time if I think they should take psychedelics. And I have kind of a pat answer for that, which is it's like asking if you can kiss me. Because if you have to ask, the answer is no.
Yeah. Having lived through this first wave psychedelic exploration through the dark age of war on drugs, what I'm thinking, the 80s and mid 90s, and then being part of this grassroots medical cannabis movement and seeing this current era of institutionalized psychedelic research. What fills you with hope and where do you have a little bit of trepidation? What's your ideal vision of the future with regards to psychedelics that are administered for therapeutic benefits?
Well, let me back up a little bit to the idea of administration of psychedelics for therapeutic benefit,
Mm,
which it's very difficult to argue with that is a real thing. There's a lot of quite good, robustly developed research that indicates that there is therapeutic potential in psychedelic experiences. That was a canny way of reopening the conversation around psychedelics, which, as you said, went through a period of decades in which it was really, when I began my doctoral work at University of California, San Francisco, I'd be sitting in the regional medical library on Parnassus Avenue looking at a computer screen at an article that said LSD is very good for you. And I'd kind of, every once in a while, I'd look over my shoulder to see who might be seeing that I was reading that,
mm,
because I was afraid that I might get into some trouble. That is all gone. The researchers, God bless the people at Johns Hopkins who really broke this open, um, very thoughtfully selected a very sympathetic population. They set about to administer psychedelics to people at the end of life who were experiencing existential anxiety about their impending death. A very it's a great population to be studying because, for one thing, you don't have to worry about whether you're going to poison your patients to death.
right.
Um, but also, you want to have sympathy for those people and to give them whatever it is that they desire and they need. And it made it easier to open up the conversation. Similarly, when MAPS began using MDMA as a way of addressing PTSD, for which there were not other very good effective treatments, they were talking about an extremely sympathetic population, which even people who had misgivings would be inclined to respond positively to. Who would not want to help returning soldiers with PTSD? Well, the thing about that is that the therapeutic uses of psychedelics have this kind of sorcerer's apprentice quality to them, in that I think pretty much anybody who can have a sensible, non-hysterical conversation about psychedelics knows that they have therapeutic uses. That's well known. What a lot of people don't know is that they have other than therapeutic uses. And I think that is an area in which we could use to do some homework and some reparative work
Mhm.
to appreciate the contexts in which psychedelics can be used for personal transformation
Mm,
and for the enhancement of creativity.
mm,
And I'm particularly interested in for the development of what are sometimes called the preternatural gifts, sometimes are called psi capabilities, like extrasensory perception, for preparation for death. Those are all, I appreciate that there's a lot of very unabashed, nobody objects or thinks it's difficult to talk about, conversation about the way in which psychedelics approach trauma, for example, for trauma healing. But I don't want that to be all there is, you know, like I think um, there are it's important for me to be cautious in talking about this, because I think in some of the places where the formula for creating a protected environment in which people can use psychedelics, in addition to the one that's therapeutic, it essentially comes from a culture of which I am not a part. And I want to be careful about appropriation, but
mm,
um, I know that, for example, um, the use of ayahuasca is more commonly done in a collective environment than it is as an individual practice by a single person. And I think there's something to be learned by cultures that have um, talked about group experiences of unusual states of consciousness, use them for acculturating young people to the social norms of civilization in which they live. All that kind of stuff exists. We just haven't tried it out yet. So I think some cautious progress in that direction. That's one of the reasons I brought up the Eleusinian mystery earlier, is that if you believe the insights of Carl Rook and Gordon Wasson and Brian Muraresku, who's written the Immortality Key, that there probably was a psychoactive potion that was administered as part of the Eleusinian mystery. There is something that's in the Western European lineage that we should maybe pay some attention to. The question is, how do you excavate stuff like that? Like Brian Muraresku was quite reasonably lamented the fact that all the artifacts that might have been part of the like altar tools of Eleusis have all been washed and sterilized and stabilized and put in museums. And now that we have sophisticated techniques where you might be able to do like micro archaeology to see what the residue of something that was in a cup might have been, it's all been dispersed. And so that's, you don't have the advantage of being able to use those technologies. But I think somebody will probably figure some of that out probably pretty soon.
How about, would you mind talking to me about women empowerment within the psychedelic movement? You created the Women's Visionary Council in 2007. And could you speak about that?
Yes. Stacy, in introducing me, mentioned that I'm part of the Hog Farm, which is a collective that I'm a relative newcomer. I only joined the Hog Farm in 1975. But you may be sure that no one forgets that. But the Hog Farm was in existence as an adventurous group of people, most of whom had had at least one important psychedelic experience, that banded together and developed a community life starting in the middle 60s. And when I think back on my early experience of that and my experience in the Haight-Ashbury environment, my experience with the Free Clinic, for example, my experience at Millbrook, women were expected to play, and didn't protest very much about playing a really traditional kind of domestic role. They were the ones who prepared the food. Diane de Prima is a perfect example of this. She was a remarkable poet, one of the more significant poets of the Beat era, who was at Millbrook. And she wrote about this, about like it was Thanksgiving and I went in the kitchen and I realized that somebody better do some cooking, or there were 14 people living in the house and they were on 11 different diets, and she had the capacity to take on feeding those people, and it was she realized that she was kind of donating her energy to something that was not necessarily her personal creativity or art product, but that she could, and the community needed her to do that, and she did those things. I think that was kind of the default mode of functioning for the early part of the psychedelic communitarian movement. The women did the normal things that were normally assigned to women in those days: take care of the kids, cook the food, wash the clothes, all that stuff. But as people developed greater both social insights and personal insights, they started to say, well, wait a minute, how come I can't drive the bus? And that has actually taken place in the community in which I live. We have pretty much worked out those kinds of role things, but there still is a preference in the sciences. The gold standard for what counts as science, as a robust study, is a controlled clinical trial. And the people who prefer a controlled clinical trial as evidence that something is real and true tend to be people who've been socialized to control. And for the most part, in our culture, that's men. So in the academic environment, in the sort of, even, you look at the history of the pranksters and who was kind of front and center for all of that. Those roles were mostly played by male members of the community. The women didn't challenge that very frequently, but by the time I finished my dissertation, which was in 2000, that was already starting to really be noticed as something to object to in the community. Dr. Hoffman had his 100th birthday a few years after that. There was a giant party planned for him. A lot of scholars from all over the world, I think it was about, I think the final panel of speakers was about 75 speakers, were invited to give different kinds of papers and presentations in his honor. I was supposed to go. I had just done my doctoral dissertation and I was supposed to go and give a paper there. But just a few weeks before it happened, my father had a heart attack. And I didn't want to leave the United States when he was not well. And so I didn't go. But quite a few of my friends went. And two of my women friends, Ann Harrison and Carolyn Garcia, who went, came back outraged because on a panel of 75 speakers, there had only been 3 or 4 women. Mm. And they said, we got to do something about this. And that's kind of the story of the Women's Visionary Council. We started a group that would have an annual colloquium at which there would be 25 speakers and 2 or 3 of them would be men. And the idea of our mission as an organization, the Women's Visionary Council, was to improve the access for women to things like positions on research teams, speaking engagements at professional conferences, publication in professional literature, interviews like this one. And during the pandemic, the WVC, which is still in existence and we're alive and well, we went through, as I think many people and organizations did, a period of soul searching in which we thought about that mission of trying to improve the appreciation of women in the larger environment around psychedelics. And we decided that we had largely prevailed in that area. Because when you look around, a lot of the people who are in leadership positions, policymaking positions, C-suite positions in the world around psychedelics are women now. So we thought that we could more profitably and productively turn the attention of the women of the Women's Visionary Council to something different. And what we decided to do was to turn it to attending to the psychedelic elders. Because those people have been through, you alluded to it just a few moments ago, the period of time in the latter part of the 20th century when psychedelics were really in bad repute in the larger society. And for those people who really had an interest in them and a devotion to them that had been provoked and was motivated by a real experience that was ineffable and undeniable in very important ways, this was not a good time for, there was legal jeopardy, there was professional jeopardy, there was sometimes economic jeopardy. Those people persevered through a dark period in relation to psychedelics. But now a lot of them are very elderly and some of them are not in a good way. And I know that when Sasha was getting toward the end of his life, that there was a concerted effort to be sure that he was receiving the kind of essentially 24-hour-a-day support that was necessary for him, which it would have been decorous for the community, which is very large, of people that owes something to the work that he did and the contributions that work made to their lives, to have been able to step up and be part of supporting him. And likewise, Anne. And so we're kind of trying to find our way in the Women's Visionary Council for how to do that. One of the things, there are a couple of different pathways that we find ourselves taking in relation to that. One is specific support for particular elders. Since the inception in 2007 of the organization, we have from time to time given what we called Laura Huxley grants. This is a sum of money given to a psychedelic elder. It's usually been a woman, but not always. Everything we do is open to all genders. There are very few conditions of this grant. The grant is, this is for you. You can only use it for yourself. You can't give it to your grandchildren. You can't donate it to another foundation. You have to use it for your own pleasure, health, or well-being. And we've been doing that on behalf of psychedelic elders since 2007. So it's getting on for 20 years now that we've been doing that from time to time. I would love to have people contribute to the Women's Visionary Council because I think we have a good track record of being responsible stewards of support of that kind, and we still do that. But the other thing that we're doing actually, which is newer and for which we have less of a track record, although we do have some, is we're very interested in archives.
Mhm.
And part of the reason for that is that that same dark period that you referred to, um, normally, I mean, for myself, I probably have almost every personal letter that was written to me since I was about 16. I haven't had to move very often, so I've been able to keep and store all that stuff. But in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, when the war on drugs was really ferocious, when the campaign against marijuana planting was active in the region where my community has its home in Northern California, I went through all those archives and purged and burnt anything that I
Wow.
thought might cause trouble for me or for anybody else.
Wow.
So those archives don't exist for me anymore. And I think that either other people either did that or even more commonly, they just didn't accumulate that stuff because it was potentially tainted with some possibility to cause trouble.
Mm.
The result of that is that when scholars of the future, and I'm not talking about next week, I'm talking about 100 years from now, want to look at what happened during that period, the paper records that other historians rely upon don't really exist unless we collect them now. So one thing we have to do now is collect and stabilize and acquire and house the records of people who have something to say about that period. And the other one is we have to encourage the psychedelic elders who are still living to relate their oral histories so that they can be recorded and made part of the historic record. Because I guarantee you, people are going to want to know about this in 100 years. They
Mm.
are.
Mm.
This has been a profoundly transformative period in this society. I was at a film showing in Mill Valley a few weeks ago in which one of the films about the Shulgin family was shown. And I'm in it. So that's why I was there. I was supposed to make a little speech. I was watching the shots that the filmmaker had taken of different social gatherings that occurred at the Shulgin farm and how, I kind of knew who the people were, so I could see like, oh, there's Torsten Passy talking to Paul Daly, and historians of the future are going to eat that stuff up. They're going
Mm.
to wonder whether people shared their formulae or their theories or their philosophies or just friendship. And that's going to be so important. And if we don't create those records now, that's not going to be available.
I like that. Is there a particular psychedelic that's been an ally for you?
Well, the doorway through which I entered this realm, and for the most part, the society that I'm part of entered this realm, was LSD.
Mhm.
So I have a continuing fondness for LSD.
Mm.
And I'm also kind of, as a scholar and as a scientist, I can't really say, oh, well, LSD is connected to the Eleusinian mystery, but there is at least a speculation that that's a possibility, that ergot was one of the contributors to that transformative state. So I would have to say that that would be mine.
Mm.
I got a chance to participate with Eric Davis and Mark McLeod in creating the book about blotter that came out during the pandemic. And they, when they were getting ready to do, it's a art book with pictures of blotter and the history of the blotters that are in it, plus a history of blotter as a way of distributing LSD. Very, I think, well done as a scholarly work. Um, but they sent me a Google Doc with about 150 pictures of blotters in it and said, do you recognize any of these blotters? And I wrote back and said, what do you think? You know, and as a result, I got to write the gallery notes for a couple of the blotters that are in there, a little bit about what I knew about them and why that image was used and so on,
Mm.
which was really fun because I feel a great fondness for LSD. I was giving a history talk to some students at the University of California a couple of days ago, and it was the history of the Haight-Ashbury specifically. And one of the things I touched on was the Trips Festival, which took place in the Longshoremen's Hall in San Francisco. It was an indoor environment in which there was music and people in costume and different kinds of light displays and quite a lot of people I think during the 3 days of the weekend, probably about 10,000 people participated, and quite a lot of them took LSD, which was readily available. This would be 1966. The environment was very similar to Burning Man, which is, orders of magnitude bigger and more florid, but the sort of general sense of let's see what your creativity can manifest in its most unfettered environment into which it has the opportunity to expand its canopy, that I think there are a tremendous number of people who've experienced great joy, which they did not easily locate in other places in those kinds of environments. That's one of the reasons that the festival environments have been as successful as they have, and that Burning Man has become the phenomenon that it is, and all of that, because people need that in their lives,
It seems to me that our society, which is so predicated around a radical kind of individualization, is lacking a certain, well, collectivism for one, but empathy for another. I see a lot of the rising authoritarian ethos and sensibility around the world, and it strikes me that we live in these siloed sort of political forums where it's kind of easy to pretend that my point of view is the only point of view. And I'm just wondering if you hold out any hope, as I do, for the kind of empathy that can be sparked through a psychedelic journey that may or may not be shared with others at the time, but incites a feeling of interconnectedness, as you spoke about, that could lead to a larger, diffuse social activism and social change.
Well, I think it was Alan Watts who said, when you get the message, hang up the phone. I don't think people need to continuously return to the area that psychedelics allow them to enter, that you can go there. And there's a wonderful novel by René Daumal that was published in the 1960s that's called Mountain Analog. It's a story about a mountain climb. And it's all about how the group of people that's going to climb this mountain goes through all this sort of arduous difficulties in getting to where they go. And then at the end, they're back in their little village, and the people in the village are kind of scratching their heads, what'd you do that for? And the guy who is their leader says, one climbs, one sees. One descends, one sees no longer, but one has seen. And there's a way of living your life in the foothills in the memory of what you've seen from the summit. I think that's a real possibility. I think that's what I see manifest in the community to which I belong. Like we've been in one form or another together since 1966, and we're still together. And our second generation is taking up a lot of our ideas and ideals. But there are positive and negative aspects to that. One thing is that I don't want to make too much of a claim of living the life that Indigenous people live, but we've lived around a lot of Indigenous people where we've seen that people don't keep doing the same thing for thousands of years if it doesn't work at all. And being available to help the people who are part of your closest social network is a good way to keep that social network happening. So if your neighbor needs a repair to their roof and you have an extra roll of tar paper, you jolly well better give it to them. And I think that doesn't really make you prosperous, which is a value that really transcends a lot of other values in the society that we're in right now. But, this is something that happened to me at Esalen. I was giving a talk around the time that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act passed in the 1990s. And I was in is it Huxley, the room that's right off the dining room? And there's a fairly big group of people listening. And I was talking about how non-Native people could support religious freedom for Native people, because it was a political issue that was a hot topic at the time. And somebody who was in the back of the room heckler said to me, why bother? Isn't this like trying to save a runt puppy? Aren't these failed civilizations? Why are you exerting yourself in this way? And I was like, wow. And I had to stop for a minute and think. And I said, well, 500 years is not a long time in human history. We'll see who's a failed civilization. And I think that practice of living out your interconnectedness with your fellows is one that has legs.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know what's ahead of us. We don't know. And I think we should be practiced and prepared to do that heartfully and skillfully if we want to keep breathing, you know?
Yeah, love that.
Amazing. Thank you. We have a question from Tatiana and Rebecca. They were both wondering, are there any opportunities to volunteer with the Women's Visionary Council, Maria?
The Women's Visionary Council has it, we are a membership organization, but not necessarily a volunteer organization. But we do really appreciate the value of celebration and having a good party to get people to pay attention to things that you think are important. And so we've always had, usually at least once a year, oftentimes more than that, some kind of an event or an experience that was available to people. In the last couple of years, we've started a new psychedelic holiday. I think maybe everybody who's in this audience right now knows that, knows about 420, knows about the Bicycle Day holiday on April 19th that celebrates the day that Dr. Hoffman took the first voluntary dose of LSD. Well, when Dr. Hoffman took his first voluntary dose of LSD, he was accompanied home on his bicycle ride by his laboratory assistant, who was a woman named Susie Ramstein. And she took care of him, stayed with him, kind of watched over him, called the family doctor, consoled him to tell him he wasn't completely going crazy, essentially functioned as the first psychedelic guide for Dr. Hoffman.
Mm.
And then a few months later, she became the first woman to take LSD as part of the sort of ordinary course of self-experimentation that was expected by scientists at that time and in that place in history. And she had, I think, 120 microgram LSD experiences or 100 microgram LSD experiences. The senior male members of the team at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals would only take 60 micrograms, but she took more, and also some experimental chemicals. On one of those adventures, she didn't have a bicycle, so she took the tram home. And it was actually recorded that she was interviewed in the early part of this century to talk about this experience by someone who's associated with us, a Swiss scholar. Um, uh, and she reported that the tram conductor was kind of weird looking and had a long nose, and that she thought it was all very jolly. So she was the first both psychedelic guide and the first woman to take LSD. And in honor of her, Susie Ramstein, the 12th of June, we have established now for the last couple of years as another psychedelic celebration day. And the last 2 years, we've had a gathering of some kind in the East Bay on that day. And we will almost certainly have one this year on June 12th. Watch our website, visionarycongress.org.
Thank you. We have another question from Noel and Mary Jo, which is, Maria, do you have a list of recommended reading regarding
Ooh.
this broad topic, especially for other than therapeutic history uses of psychedelics?
Oh, there's so many good books. My goodness. I mentioned Mount Analog. That's a wonderful book. That's a novel. Renee Daumal, Daumal. There's a wonderful book called Psychedelia. The author is unfortunately dead, but that's a very good, very comprehensive history of psychedelics. There's a wonderful book called High Culture. Soma, The Divine Mushroom of Immortality. That's a wonderful book. Pikal and Tikal, which are essentially love stories of the Shulgins, in which Sasha recorded a lot of the formulae for the discoveries that he was making, because he wanted to be sure that those things were not able to be suppressed and eradicated the way that a lot of Nikola Tesla's discoveries were. There's a wonderful compendium called Higher Wisdom that was collected by Roger Walsh and Charlie Grob from essays that were presented by what were at that time understood to be psychedelic elders in 1998. A lot of those people are now deceased, and they had a chance to record and present the kinds of insights and archival materials that I now wish that we would get busy and record and produce some more of. Those are just the ones I can think of right off the top of my head.
Do you think that the underground exists anymore?
Yes, in fact, I do. And I actually want to say something sober about that. I spoke in praise of Johns Hopkins and the very robust and well-constructed research that has been done there. But if in all of the studies that they have done, they are responsible for 1,000 administrations of LSD or other psychedelics, that would be a lot. There are people in the underground, individuals in the underground, who are responsible for 4,000 or 5,000 administrations as individuals. They're the wisdom and expertise and experience that can guide us into a responsible, acculturated use of these sacred substances in the future is more likely to be found in the underground than it is in the legit research environment. And I think that's part of why I'm so interested in the psychedelic elders. We have to protect them and allow their stories to be told, or their wisdom is going to disappear when they do.
Thank you so much. We are gonna wrap it up here. I just want to thank Maria, you and Sam so much for this lovely discussion today. And thank you so, so, so much for joining us today on this lovely Sunday morning afternoon.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show was produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Until next time, be well.